One of the greatest gifts in my life is the fact that my entire existence and my childhood growing up with dad was all captured on camera.
There is a particular moment that ends up defining a family's public story. Not the moment everyone expects, but a quieter one that arrives sideways, catches a mother completely off guard, and forces the whole world to see something it had been looking at wrong for years. For Terri Irwin, that moment happened on a dance floor in Los Angeles, in front of television cameras, decades after the tragedy that first made her family famous for reasons no one would have chosen. She wasn't watching her son perform. She was watching him become someone she barely had words for. And for the first time in almost 20 years, she let herself fall apart in public. To understand why that moment hit as hard as it did, you have to go back to where this family story actually starts, not with fame, but with loss. Robert Clarence Irwin was born on December 1st, 2003, in Queensland, Australia, the younger of Steve and Terri Irwin's two children. He arrived into a family that was already famous, already beloved, already synonymous with wild animals and reckless enthusiasm, and a father who seemed physically incapable of standing still. Robert's early childhood was spent the way most people imagine an Irwin childhood, surrounded by reptiles, near his father constantly, growing up on the grounds of Australia Zoo as though the whole property were simply an extension of the family home. Then, on September 4th, 2006, everything changed. Steve Irwin was fatally injured by a stingray barb while filming near Bad Reef, off the coast of Port Douglas. He was 44 years old. Robert was not yet 3. That detail matters more than people tend to give it credit for. A 3-year-old does not form lasting memories the way an older child or an adult does. Robert Irwin grew up without any real, independent recollection of his father, not because he wasn't there, but because he was too young when his father left. Everything Robert knows about Steve comes secondhand. Home videos, old wildlife footage, stories Terri told him at bedtime, and the strange experience of watching strangers' faces light up the moment they learn his last name. That is its own particular kind of grief. Most people who lose a parent young at least have some fragments of memory to hold on to. A voice, a smell, a specific afternoon. Robert had almost none of that. He inherited a legacy without ever getting the chance to build a relationship with the man who created it. And underneath the cameras and the smiling photos of a toddler with a python draped over his shoulders, that absence was quietly shaping who he would become. Terri, meanwhile, was left to handle something almost impossible to comprehend. She was suddenly a single parent to a 9-year-old and a 2-year-old. She was the face of a global wildlife conservation brand that had, overnight, lost its most recognizable ambassador. She had a zoo to run, employees depending on her, and a grief so enormous and so public that she barely had room to process it privately. In interviews over the years, she has described that period honestly, not as some smooth, made-for-television transition into strength, but as a genuine scramble to figure out how to function at all, while the entire world watched to see what she would do next. What she chose to do was keep going. She kept Australia Zoo running. She kept Steve's conservation work alive. And she raised 2 children who somehow, against fairly steep odds, grew into adults who seemed to have absorbed the best parts of both their parents rather than being crushed under the weight of what they lost. It's worth remembering, too, that Terri wasn't originally part of this world at all. She grew up in Oregon, in the United States, running a family wildlife rehabilitation business long before she ever set foot in Australia. She met Steve on a visit to his zoo in 1991, and within a year they were married. She didn't inherit a passion for animals. She built one alongside him, from the ground up, long before either of them had any idea their lives would become the subject of international television. That history matters, because it means the zoo Terri kept running after Steve's death wasn't simply a monument to her husband. It was something she had helped build with her own hands, something she understood at a technical and emotional level most outside observers never fully grasped. She wasn't a widow keeping a shrine open. She was a co-founder continuing a life's work that had always, in some sense, belonged to both of them. That distinction shaped how she raised her children. Robert and Bindi weren't raised to treat Steve's memory as untouchable or sacred in a way that would freeze them in place. They were raised inside an ongoing, living mission, one that required daily decisions, daily work, and daily engagement with the same animals and the same conservation causes their father had cared about. Grief, in the Irwin household, wasn't something to be managed from a distance. It was folded into the work itself. That may be part of why both of Terri's children ended up building such distinctly individual public identities, rather than simply performing nostalgia for cameras. They grew up inside the mission, not outside looking in at a memory. Robert's childhood after his father's death played out partly in private and partly in front of cameras, which is its own strange balancing act. By the time he was a small child, he was already making television appearances with Terri and Bindi, and people noticed something almost immediately. This wasn't a kid being paraded around for sentimental value. He had an ease around animals that looked less like a performance and more like instinct. He would handle snakes and crocodiles with a kind of calm that unsettled adults twice his age. As Robert moved through adolescence, the comparisons to his father only intensified. It wasn't just that he'd inherited an interest in wildlife. Plenty of kids raised around animals developed that. It was the specific mannerisms, the way he'd get animated mid-sentence, talking about a creature most people would run from, the particular tilt of his head, the boundless, slightly chaotic energy in front of a camera. People who had grown up watching Steve's old specials started saying, almost involuntarily, that watching Robert felt like watching footage they'd already seen, except younger. For Terri, that resemblance wasn't simple. It's easy to assume that a mother would find pure comfort in seeing her late husband reflected in her son. Sometimes she has said exactly that certain moments feel like getting a small piece of Steve back. But grief rarely stays in one lane. Watching your child turn into an echo of someone you lost is also, inevitably, a fresh confrontation with the loss itself. Every flash of similarity is joy and heartbreak arriving in the same instant. And Terri has spoken about experiencing both at once more times than she probably expected to. What made Robert's story genuinely interesting, though, wasn't just that he resembled his father. It's that he refused to simply live inside that resemblance. He built something that was recognizably his own. There's a version of this story where Robert coasts, where he shows up occasionally, trades on the family name, and lets the Irwin brand do the heavy lifting. Nobody would have blamed him for that. Instead, starting in his early teenage years, Robert began building a public presence that stood on its own. He became a regular guest on late-night television, appearing repeatedly on The Tonight Show alongside a rotating cast of animals, handling each one with a composure and depth of knowledge that consistently caught hosts and audiences off guard. He wasn't reciting facts. He clearly knew what he was talking about, and he genuinely loved doing it. Photography became another outlet entirely separate from television. Robert developed a serious eye for wildlife and conservation photography, and in 2020, at just 17 years old, he won the People's Choice Award at the Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition, one of the most respected wildlife photography awards in the world. His winning image, taken by drone near the Steve Irwin Wildlife Reserve in Cape York, captured the stark line between untouched forest and land devastated by the bushfires that had torn through Australia that year. Tens of thousands of people voted for that photograph, drawn to the way it captured both destruction and hope in a single frame. Robert later said the honor meant more to him as a reminder of humanity's responsibility toward the natural world and as a personal achievement, a distinction that says a fair amount about how he'd been raised. By his late teens and early 20s, Robert Irwin had built a public identity that existed alongside his father's legacy rather than underneath it. He was a wildlife photographer with real accolades, a television personality who could hold his own on a national stage, a conservationist whose advocacy was rooted in urgency and evidence rather than nostalgia. He wasn't asking people to care about animals because his father once had. He was showing them, in real time, what was disappearing and asking what they intended to do about it. Consider what that actually required of him. Robert grew up with a surname that carried more weight than almost anyone his age will ever have to manage. Every camera pointed at him from the time he could walk came loaded with an implicit comparison he never asked for and couldn't opt out of. Every animal he handled, every interview he gave, every public appearance was quietly measured against the ghost of a man he had almost no personal memory of. Most people placed under that kind of pressure either shrink away from the spotlight entirely or lean into an exaggerated performance of what's expected of them. Robert didn't either. He became more specific instead of less, more precisely, recognizably himself, rather than a tribute act, wearing his father's mannerisms like a costume. That specificity showed up in small, cumulative ways. His conservation messaging wasn't framed around Steve's memory. It was framed around current data, current urgency, and species loss. He was documenting himself, in real time, often from behind his own camera lens. He talked about habitat destruction the way a field researcher would, not the way someone reciting a script written by someone else might. That shift, from nostalgia toward action, was something that belonged entirely to him, and it was exactly the kind of quiet, self-directed growth that Terri had spent years hoping to see take root. The proof that her son wasn't just surviving under the weight of a famous name, but actively building something of his own underneath it. And then, almost out of nowhere, came an entirely different kind of spotlight. In April 2025, it was announced that Robert Irwin would be joining the 34th season of Dancing with the Stars, a competition series that has, over the years, become something like a rite of passage for public figures willing to be genuinely vulnerable in front of a national audience. He was paired with professional dancer Whitney Carson, a two-time champion of the show, and the season premiered on ABC and Disney Plus in September 2025. Robert had a personal connection to the show already. A decade earlier, his older sister Bindi Irwin had competed on the same series at just 17 years old and won the entire competition alongside professional partner Derek Hoff. Robert had been in the audience for that victory as an 11-year-old, watching his sister lift the Mirrorball trophy. He would later describe that memory as something he'd carried with him, a small, specific dream that he never expected to actually get the chance to chase himself. What followed over the course of the season surprised even people who follow the show closely. Robert had essentially no dance background walking in. He wasn't a natural performer in the traditional sense, but week after week, something started to click. Not just technically, but emotionally. Robert brought a kind of sincerity to the ballroom that read differently than the usual competition polish. He wasn't performing a version of himself designed to win votes. He was visibly, sometimes uncomfortably, present in every routine, and audiences responded to that honesty in a way that turned him into one of the season's most talked-about competitors. For anyone paying close attention, something bigger was happening underneath the choreography. For the first time in his public life, Robert wasn't standing in a frame built around his father's memory. He wasn't the Crocodile hunter's son, doing a nice tribute performance. He was simply Robert Irwin, live on a stage, being evaluated on his own terms, in real time, with millions of people watching. That distinction, once it became visible, was hard to unsee, for the audience, and especially for Terri. On October 14, 2025, Dancing with the Stars aired its annual dedication night, an episode built entirely around emotional tribute performances, where each competitor dances in honor of someone significant in their life. Robert chose his mother. In the lead-up to the performance, Robert had been open on social media about how difficult the rehearsal week had been. He described it as emotionally exhausting in a way that went beyond the usual physical demands of the competition. A week spent sitting with feelings about his father's absence and his mother's role in holding the family together that he doesn't often put into words publicly. The routine itself was a contemporary piece set to Phil Collins' You'll Be in My Heart, the ballad originally written for Disney's Tarzan, a song about a parent's unconditional love and protection, chosen deliberately for what it meant to Robert's relationship with Terri. He and Whitney Carson performed a slow, deeply physical routine built around loss, protection, and gratitude. Near the end of the dance, in a moment the show had newly introduced that season, Terri herself walked onto the ballroom floor and joined her son for the final part of the performance. What happened next wasn't subtle. Robert broke down in his mother's arms as the music ended. Bindi, watching from nearby, rushed out to embrace them both. The judges, normally composed under bright lights and rolling cameras, were visibly emotional. One judge, fighting back tears himself, told Robert that his father was watching and smiling, and that the performance had been an honest expression of love in its purest form. Another judge, who had coached Bindi through her own championship run a decade earlier, said that if she'd ever had children of her own, she would have wanted a son exactly like Robert. The host had to step in to comfort him as he composed himself before the scores were even read. Terri, seated in the audience, was already in tears before the music had finished. Afterward, she posted publicly about how honored she felt that Robert had chosen her, describing the love she and Steve had always talked about as parents, and calling it a night she would carry with her permanently. She didn't try to explain away the emotion or minimize it. She simply let it be exactly what it was. The clip spread almost immediately. Within days, it had become one of the most discussed moments of that entire television season. Not because it was flashy or technically perfect, but because it was real in a way that's genuinely rare on competition television. People who had never watched a single episode of the show found themselves watching a 3-minute clip of a young man breaking down in his mother's arms and understanding, almost instantly, exactly what they were looking at. For Terri, the significance went deeper than a single emotional television moment. She had spent nearly 2 decades absorbing grief privately while presenting composure publicly, because that's what the job required. She didn't have the luxury of falling apart in front of her children when they needed her to be steady. Watching Robert stand on that stage and articulate, in front of millions of strangers, exactly how much her steadiness had cost her and exactly how much he'd noticed, that was something entirely different. For the first time in a long time, someone else was doing the emotional heavy lifting, and it turned out that was something she'd needed far more than she'd let herself admit. As the season moved toward its conclusion, another story began circulating that added a different kind of weight to Robert's run. In the days before the finale, it emerged that Robert had been competing through a genuine physical injury, a strain affecting the intercostal muscles between his ribs, the kind of injury that makes it painful just to breathe deeply, let alone perform demanding lifts and turns on live television. His partner, Whitney Carson, later explained that portions of the choreography for the finale had quietly been adjusted to work around the injury, after one particular lift, during rehearsals, had caused him serious pain. When asked about it directly, Robert didn't frame it as some kind of sacrifice or headline-worthy hardship. He talked about it the way he tends to talk about most difficult things, matter-of-factly, almost dismissively, as though pushing through discomfort to finish something he committed to wasn't really a decision at all, just the obvious thing to do. That detail, small as it seemed at the time, said something quiet but real about how Robert had been raised. It's the kind of instinct that tends to show up in people who've watched a parent absorb enormous strain without making a show of it, who learned, without ever being explicitly taught, that showing up and finishing the job matters more than being seen struggling to do it. The season 34 finale aired on November 25, 2025, and by that point, the show had become something of a cultural moment in its own right. The episode reportedly drew a record-setting number of viewer votes, more than double the total from the previous year's finale. Robert and Whitney performed 3 separate routines that night: a Judge's Choice Quickstep, an instant dance challenge where competitors learn a new routine with only minutes of preparation, and a final freestyle performance built to showcase everything they developed across the season. Despite the injury, and despite adjustments made to protect his ribs, Robert and Whitney delivered a freestyle that drew a standing ovation before the judges even spoke. When the scores and votes were tallied, Robert Irwin was named the champion of season 34, exactly 10 years after his sister Bindi had won the same competition with the same trophy, on the same stage. The symmetry of that moment wasn't lost on anyone watching, and it certainly wasn't lost on Terri. She had now watched both of her children stand in that ballroom, a decade apart, holding the same trophy, having built those achievements almost entirely on their own terms. In interviews following the win, Robert reflected on what the experience had meant to him, not in terms of the competition itself, but in terms of what it represented about connection and storytelling. He described realizing, partway through the season, that the show wasn't really about dancing at all. It was about being willing to be honest in front of an audience, week after week, and trusting that honesty would land. He talked about the trophy as something that represented more than his own effort, a nod to the legacy his parents had built together, and to everything his mother had carried alone in the years since his father's death. There's a specific kind of relief that only arrives after years of quiet, unspoken worry. The moment a parent finally sees proof that their child is going to be okay, not just surviving, but genuinely, fully themselves. For Terri Irwin, that relief arrived in fragments across an entire television season, in a contemporary dance set to a lullaby about protection, in a freestyle performed through physical pain nobody wanted to make a big deal out of, and in a trophy lifted a decade after a daughter had lifted the same one. None of it erased what the family had lost. Terri has never pretended it did, but watching her son stand fully in his own identity, recognizably shaped by his father, but entirely, unmistakably his own person, was the kind of confirmation she'd spent almost 20 years quietly hoping to see and quietly terrified she might not. When it finally arrived, in front of a national audience, in the middle of a ballroom, she didn't try to hold it together. She let herself fall apart, in the good way, for possibly the first time in a very long time. Steve Irwin used to talk about wanting to eventually step back and hand the mission forward to the next generation, about how that transition would be the real marker of whether he'd actually succeeded at what he set out to do. He never got the chance to see that happen. Instead, it fell to Terri to carry the mission forward alone, in the form of a zoo to run, 2 children to raise, and a global audience watching to see what would happen next. It's easy, from the outside, to reduce a story like this down to a single viral clip, a son crying in his mother's arms on a dance floor, a trophy held up under bright lights. But the years leading up to that moment were made of far less cinematic material. Early mornings at the zoo, homework done between television tapings, a mother learning to run a conservation empire while privately grieving a partner she'd built it with. None of that made it into highlight reels. It happened quietly, over roughly 2 decades, largely out of view. The ballroom moment only landed the way it did because of everything that came before it, because millions of people watching at home could sense, even without knowing the specifics, that they were witnessing the payoff of a much longer, much harder story. There's also something worth noting about what Robert chose to do with the platform Dancing with the Stars handed him. He could have used a season of national television exposure to simply raise his own profile, the way plenty of competitors do. Instead, week after week, he kept steering the conversation back toward his family, his mother, and the conservation work that mattered to him long before any of this started. That instinct, to use visibility as a vehicle for something bigger than himself, is difficult to fake, and even harder to teach. It tends to come from watching someone else do the same thing first. What happened next was this: a 21-year-old standing in a ballroom, holding a trophy, publicly crediting his mother with everything he'd become. A young man who took grief that could easily have swallowed him and turned it into direction instead, and a mother who had spent 2 decades holding everything together long enough to finally watch it pay off, and who, for one night, didn't have to hold anything together at all. What did you think of Robert and Terri Irwin's journey through this unforgettable season? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real stories behind the headlines, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.